Trains have appeared in many films throughout the years, as everything from the setting of the story to being part of a greater action set piece. As cool as these scenes are, not all of these engines are true to real life, and that gets on my nerves. So today, we're going to take a look at everything wrong with the trains in Before we look at the trains, let's first look at the context. Sometime in the late 1950s, child Tom Hanks, or some kind of alien entity that has taken the form of child Tom Hanks, is struggling to go to sleep on Christmas Eve. He's starting to have doubts that Santa really exists, and the existential terror that something he's believed in his whole life isn't real is keeping him awake. Just as he's dozing off, he's rudely awakened by a literal express train pulling up outside his house. Upon investigation, Tom Hanks steps off and informs him that this train is bound for the North Pole, and that child Tom Hanks should probably get on board if he wants to keep his Christmas spirit. Child Tom Hanks hesitantly hops on and the train sets off. While finding his seat, we meet unnamed female protagonist who mostly just stares at people and
Hey!
The train stops for another kid who looks like he got a little greedy when adjusting his x-axis, and we watch him figure out how to run in real time as the train pulls away. Some emergency brake pulling later, the express is underway and the kids get served some hot chocolate.
You know, Montezuma...
Stare Girl takes some to the wide kid but leaves her ticket on her seat, and rather than wait for her to get back, child Tom Hanks grabs it and tries to give it to her, losing it in the process. Some shenanigans later, the ticket ends up back on the express just as Stare Girl is getting dragged away by the conductor. Boy finds it once again and tries to take it to her, this time keeping it safe. Climbing onto the roof for some reason to follow them, he meets the Hanks of Christmas Past who makes the kid drink sock water while further worsening his existential dread.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!
The hobo helps child Tom Hanks to the front of the train where he meets Stare Girl once again. Some piddling about with brakes, reindeer and tracks laid so questionably that it makes the Penn Central look like an engineering marvel by comparison later, the express skids across a frozen lake. Now, everyone who knows anything about trains, and even the ones who don't, know that the physics in this scene are nonsense at best. But I have a theory on how they could steer a locomotive on solid ice. But we'll get onto that later.
I can't believe you found my ticket!
Once they're back on track, they bend around a mountain and Hanks of Christmas Past uses some toys to harass child Tom Hanks. Boy eventually meets up with Stare Girl and have a little sing-song with the wide kid just as they reach the North Pole. The rest of the kids give us a musical number as the express pulls into town and conductor Hanks is overjoyed they made it on time. Can I also say I'm a massive fan of this visual gag where a character who wears a hat has some hair on their head but is completely bald where the hat sits? Just a solid visual punchline.
Hey, what gives? It was 5 minutes till midnight 4 minutes ago.
Exactly!
Arriving among a sea of elves, the train comes to a stop and the kids depart to go and meet Santa, with Wide Kid deciding to stay on the train. In fairness, I'd be hesitant to get off too if I had a first-class carriage all to myself. Child Tom Hanks and Stare Girl try to persuade him to come with them, but the carriage ends up rolling down a hill and the trio are left to explore the now empty North Pole on their own. Also, this is the movie's halfway point. You'd think that a film called The Polar Express would sort of wrap up once the train completed its journey, but I guess not. After about 15 minutes of walking around what feels like an empty Gmod server, watching elves stalk a child and landing in Santa's sack, the kids eventually end up back with everyone else. Child Tom Hanks, despite riding on a magical train, literally walking around the North Pole and now surrounded by elves, still somehow doubts Santa exists, and so we have a little I believe moment before finally meeting the big guy himself. Hanks Claus gives the first gift of Christmas to child Tom Hanks and flies around for a bit, sparking more existential dread in some of the other kids.
Could all this be nothing but a dream?
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up!
No!
Just like in Gmod, Santa messes around for a bit before accidentally undoing the sled and disappearing. With that, Christmas is over and everyone gets a life lesson punched into their ticket. Turns out child Tom Hanks put the sleigh bell he was given in a ripped pocket and lost it, so he goes home still somehow doubtful about Christmas. The next day he finds the bell under the tree and his Christmas spirit / belief in Santa or whatever his character arc was is restored. Overall, nothing special, but still has enough fun and whimsy to make it a nice Christmas movie. Tom Hanks does a lot of the heavy lifting in this film. Despite playing multiple people, he still manages to give each character their own personality and charm. I can't lie though, the film definitely feels padded out in a lot of places. The second half feels like they finished writing the script then realised they needed to fill out another 20 minutes. Not to say I hate it, in fact the movie is quite comfy and the North Pole, despite being an industrial landscape, has a pretty cozy vibe to it. I think the best way to sum it up is it feels like a nice movie to have on in the background. But that's enough film reviewing. We're here to look at... Given that this was an animated movie, it would have been easy enough to just make up an engine to pull the Polar Express, but instead, production decided to go the whole hog and digitally recreated a real locomotive, this being Père Marquette number 1225. The story of how 1225 ended up in the film is quite an interesting one. After being withdrawn from service, the engine was donated to Michigan State University in 1957 as something for engineering students to study. It was put on display outside Spartan Stadium until 1970, when the Michigan State University Railroad Club decided to try and restore it. It wasn't easy, but by 1985, 1225 was working again and has since enjoyed an easy life in preservation. That same year, author Chris Van Allsburg published his book The Polar Express, which he had both written and illustrated himself. Having played on 1225 as a child while it was on display, Allsburg decided to base his drawing of the Polar Express on the engine. Years later, in 2002, Warner Bros. Acquired the rights to make a film adaptation of the Polar Express, and production was looking for a locomotive they could use in the film. Of all the engines they could have chosen, they ended up going with 1225 as someone luckily managed to keep hold of the engine's original blueprints. Whether or not they knew it was the engine that inspired the original book, I'm unsure. It's possible production chose the engine because it naturally resembled the engine in the book, but it's also believed that the engine's number played a part in being chosen too, as 1225 is Christmas Day, in countries that write the date incorrectly. The reason I don't fully believe 1225 was picked intentionally was because Allsburg himself was surprised to see the engine on screen when the film was released. What you might not have known is that the railway influences on the Polar Express aren't just limited to 1225. The carriages that make up the Express are based on the heavyweight steel cars built by Pullman in the 1930s, while the clock tower, factory buildings, and general architecture of the North Pole are all based on the Pullman plant in Chicago. You can honestly tell a lot of care went into modelling and animating the engine in this film. So much so that sound recordists captured audio of 1225 working so the Polar Express could sound as close to the real thing as possible. But we're not here to praise this film. We're here to grab its weirdly malformed face and go over what's wrong with it. Starting off strong as the train isn't even on screen for the first error. As the Express approaches Hero Boy's house, yes, his name in the credits is just Hero Boy, he watches several carriages go by. Yet, as he walks outside, the train has stopped so that the first carriage is right in front of his house, meaning somewhere between him getting out of bed and opening the front door, the train reversed. The amount of steam that's surrounding the train is also a bit strange. The way it rolls out from under the carriages implies that they're the ones letting off steam. Sure, carriages would have had steam heating around this time period, but to be leaking steam like that means Santa really isn't taking care of his rolling stock. Also, if you want to be extra picky, 1225 and the other N1s were primarily used for pulling freight, not passengers, so really it's not the best engine to pick to pull an express. A nice detail I will give them credit for is how the train doesn't just move as one unit, but rather each carriage only starts moving when the one ahead of it pulls on its coupling, giving the carriages that slight jerky start many old trains had. I won't make any comments on the carriage interiors because as much as I could say this or that is wrong, Carriages, historically speaking, are usually heavily customised by and for the railroads they run on, so it'd be a bit of a wasted effort to nitpick what would and wouldn't be there. The next error we get is...
Hey, you. Yeah, you. Do you know what kind of train this is?
Boy, I'm gonna start calling this kid X from the amount of misinformation he's spreading. So in the script, Know-It-All Kid says that the locomotive pulling the train is a Baldwin 284 S3 class Berkshire type steam locomotive built in 1931 at the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It has 69-inch driving wheels, 26-inch cylinder bore and 34-inch stroke. The engine weighs 456,100 pounds and has a tractive effort of 83,450 pounds. Let's go over that point by point. First of all, the engine was built by the Lima Locomotive Works, not Baldwin. It does have a 284 wheel arrangement, known as a Berkshire layout, so he's right there. While Baldwin did build Berkshire engines, none were ever classified as S3s. 1225, the engine pulling the train, is an N1 class engine. He also claims the engine was built in 1931, when in reality the N1s were built in 1941. He does get the wheel and cylinder size and stroke correct, but the engine is slightly lighter and not quite as powerful as he claims it is. Now, it is possible that he has got his wires a little crossed, as Lima did produce the S3 class engines for the Nickel Plate Road in 1944, the S3s also being Berkshires with similar proportions, but frankly, he's annoying. And you know what we say to annoying characters? When Hero Boy pulls the emergency brake to let the wide kid get on, we see that the locomotive's wheels immediately grind to a halt. Even with the brakes hard on, the wheels on a steam locomotive generally tend to keep turning if its throttle is open and it's already in motion, just with a significant amount of resistance. To immediately stop like this means the Polar Express has some damn good brake blocks on it. Also, the pilot wheels at the front too have brakes. As far as I'm aware, the N1s didn't have brakes on their pilot wheels, so I guess that's another inaccuracy. Either that or the Polar Express just has more brakes in it than the Berlin Wall. While crossing between the carriages, there's just this big, unprotected gap between them. Gangway connectors had been around for decades at this point. In fact, it was Pullman that popularized them in the US, so why these Pullman-style carriages don't have gangway connectors just baffles me. In this shot of the woods, as we watch the train pass, suddenly the Express, which at the beginning of the film clearly had 5 carriages, now suddenly has, count them with me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 19! Where the extra 14 came from is a mystery. Just as mysterious is where they all go to later, as next time we see the train there are only 5 carriages again. Also, when the ticket makes its way back onto the train, it flutters into the second carriage from the engine, not the fourth where all the kids are. Yet, all the kids seem to be in the second carriage anyway. And yes, I watched the scene in slow motion to double check. For some reason, the conductor decides the best way to get Stair Girl to the front of the train is to just walk along the roof of a moving train in heavy snow. I want to think of a way I can justify this, but I got nothing, especially seeing how later on they show them all getting into the front carriage from the engine without climbing on the roof. Speaking of the roof, when we first see the Polar Express, there's no snow on its roof at all, but here it's pretty much white over. Even if it's snowing heavily, the speed of the train combined with the fact the carriages are heated means there shouldn't be any snow at all sticking to the roof. At the skiing part, the train starts climbing an absurdly steep grade. For those who don't know, only a tiny part of an engine's wheel touches the rail at any given time. This lack of surface area is what allows trains to go so fast, but also means they don't have much grip. Don't get me wrong, engines have tackled some impressive hills in their time, but a nearly 60-degree angle on regular rails while pulling a load? Let's just say the sanding gear would need to be dumping super glue onto the tracks to make it even a quarter of the way up.
But train of thought, have you considered that it's a magical train? So surely it could climb the hill easily.
I don't care! If I brushed over every nonsense detail in this film and said that it's okay because it's a magic train, that'd defeat the whole purpose of this video, wouldn't it? Plus, why did they make it climb such a steep gradient here when they dug a tunnel on the other side of the hill? Surely it'd be better to dig another tunnel instead of climbing the grade. Going downhill, the engine picks up a hell of a lot of speed. Most people would be worried about staying on the rails or losing control of the engine going at speeds like that, but my concern would be how badly your ears would pop going through such a tight tunnel at such a high speed. Don't know what kind of coal Santa supplies his engines with, but it generally isn't very comfortable to jump into. And if you got buried in it, you'd probably come out filthy and with a bad case of black lung too. These gauges in the cab are at 0 and the boiler pressure looks to be at about 80 psi, which to me doesn't quite seem right for an engine travelling at such high speeds. Must be those leaking pipes. The driver and fireman messing with the light on the front of the engine, while not technically an inaccuracy as some engine crews have had to check and maintain parts of the locomotive while it was in motion, do still get a ding for their shoddy handling of the job. I don't know about you, but regardless of the results, I feel like that qualifies as some kind of employee harassment. Also, Conductor Hanks pulls on the fireman's beard 2 short times and 1 long time, the standard signal used when approaching a crossing. Just a fun little bit of trivia while you're watching these 4 torture this guy. With the deer all clear, the train sets off again, and we might as well take this moment while we're close up to the engine to cover everything that's wrong with it. Firstly is the whistle. Not only is it mounted in the wrong place, but it changes too. In the beginning of the film, the sound it makes is that of 1225's whistle. But later on, the whistle sound is replaced with that of Sierra No. 3, the engine that explodes at the end of Back to the Future. Its headlamp is mounted inside the smoke box instead of outside, it's missing its feed water heater, number boards, builder's plate and front coupler, and the cowcatcher is slightly bigger too. The fireman also has to shovel coal into the engine, which is quite cruel when you consider the N1s had mechanical stokers to help keep up with the demand of the boiler. These things burnt 1 ton of coal for every 12 miles travelled, so this chap really has his work cut out for him. I'm telling you, the sooner he gets signed up with a fireman's union, the better. For some reason, the driver pushes the throttle forwards when he should be pulling it backwards to start the engine, and as it sets off, the wheels turn out of sync with its chuffs. Listen. Gotta give a ding for this poor driving technique too. When the throttle jams, the driver just yanks at it instead of trying to work it gently. Real yank-happy crew we have here. That's how you break stuff. Steam engines are sensitive machines, you know. And yes, I am aware there is a flux capacitor in the engine's cab. Robert Zemeckis, who directed this film, also did Back to the Future. It's an Easter egg, no further comment. Also, why are these 3 just standing on the front of the engine? They had plenty of time to get back into the cab, yet they chose to stand there, exposed to the freezing cold? What? And here we arrive at the roller coaster scene. Don't ask me why, but for some reason when Hollywood sees trains, a producer just immediately imagines a roller coaster. Massive climbs, extreme drops, and ludicrous speed. Oh, and an incorrectly labelled sign. We've already been over how the train shouldn't be able to climb such a steep gradient in the first place, but going down it has some interesting implications too. Firstly, this apex is too sharp, the engine and carriages would just bottom out going over it. Secondly, while going downhill, the water in the boiler would all rush to the front of the engine, leaving the firebox crown sheet exposed. If the crown sheet doesn't have enough water on it to disperse the heat of the engine's fire, it'll weaken and the pressure in the boiler would cause it to explode. However, the steam in the boiler would cool the crown sheet just enough to stop it exploding for the short time the Polar Express flies down the hill, so no ding there. Where there is a firebox issue, however, is all the hot coals that make up the fire. The scene implies that as the train travels down the hill, everything inside it is in freefall, so it's safe to assume that some of the coal in the firebox is floating around too. Given the amount of air that's drawn through the firebox combined with the weightlessness, it's more than likely that a lot of coal would be pulled through the boiler tubes, either getting blasted out the engine's funnel or becoming stuck and reducing airflow, dampening the engine's performance. On top of that, once the coal settles again, it'll likely all be piled up near the front end of the firebox. Coal needs to be evenly spread in the firebox, A, to burn more efficiently, but B, so that all the heat isn't concentrated in one area, which can melt and warp the grate the coals sit on. This won't be a major issue here, given the fireman is pretty attentive after the downhill shenanigans, but it certainly isn't good for the engine. And just because, let's throw 2 more dings on the counter for whatever this track design is, and the fact that the rails are just floating in some places. And then we go from one extreme to the other, crazy tracks to no tracks. Now, it isn't entirely impossible for a layer of ice to carry the weight of a steam locomotive. I've covered the subject in a video that you should probably go and watch after this, but I think it's safe to say that if a metal pin can cause the ice to shatter, it's certainly not thick enough to carry the weight of a locomotive weighing 200 tons.
But train of thought, it's a magic train. That's why it doesn't fall through the ice.
But what if it didn't fall through the ice? Could the driver hypothetically steer the engine to get it back on the tracks? Well, put on your tinfoil hats. I have a theory. So, the driver puts the engine in reverse. For the sake of argument, we'll say he's put the sanding gears on so he has better traction. As much as the carriages should just roll in a straight line, their wheels are shown to dig into the ice a little, so them zigzagging as the engine reverses into them kinda checks out. The tender, moving to a sharp angle, would jackknife the locomotive and force it to swing left as we see, and while the engine doesn't have enough momentum to drift once the driver slams on the brakes, you can make the argument that the ice is slippery and the momentum of the carriages helps carry the swing. Now, midway through the swing, the driver puts the engine into full forwards. This way, when the engine is ahead of the carriages enough, it can start pulling on them and use them to help go in a straight line. How can the carriages help the engine go in a straight line, I hear you ask? Drag. The engine still has to pull the carriages, and so the drag they produce can help angle the locomotive. In this shot, the engine is going forwards but is still skidding to its left. As it starts pulling more carriages with it, however, their weight holds the engine back, causing it to correct itself. Once the train is moving in a straight line, it then becomes a matter of braking the carriages at the right time to help steer the engine. Imagine a balloon with an arrow drawn on it and a piece of string tied to the end. The balloon is the engine and the string is the carriages. Bear with me on this. We want the arrow to point upwards. In order to get the arrow to point up, as the balloon floats upwards, we pull on the string. The force from the string pulling the bottom of the balloon down makes it so that the balloon has no choice but to move with the arrow pointing up. If the arrow becomes slightly crooked, we gently pull the string again to apply the same resistance. By pulling back, we help correct the direction the arrow on the balloon points. Now, apply this to the train. As it's moving forwards, should it start to veer too much to one direction, we can apply the carriage brakes and pull the rear of the locomotive the opposite way it's going, causing it to turn in the direction we want. And that is how you drive a steam locomotive on the ice. That make any sense to you? No? Good. Me neither. I was bloody wasted when I came up with that theory. If anything, it's helped me realise that hitting this massive chunk of ice would probably smash the boiler and valve gear, the engine should have tipped over here, the couplers would have broken at this angle, the driver makes an absolute meal of the controls, and all that skidding around would have bent the flanges on the locomotive's wheels completely out of line. Alright, now we've finally gotten that scene out of the way, it's smooth sailing from here on out. Just a handful of inaccuracies left to go. Let's see, there's this shot of the train climbing a mountain. Not only is it another one of those pesky super steep grades, but the engine and carriages physically bend around the spiral like it's Uzumaki. Last minute addition here, the lights are shown to be off in this carriage, but are shown to be on from the outside. What's that all about? Ghosts, probably. Arriving at the North Pole, the train is magically longer again, and then goes back to only having 5 carriages a few shots later. While climbing aboard the rear carriage, Hero Boy accidentally steps on the coupling release lever, and honestly, who in their right mind would put that lever there? A lever that you need to push downwards to uncouple the carriage, and you mount it right next to a set of steps where someone could accidentally stand on it. For some reason, the carriage starts rolling backwards, but given that we know it has air brakes, the brakes should just come on as soon as the brake pipe became disconnected. This point switching system is just a complete mystery to me. Firstly, that's just an overcomplicated design for a set of points, and secondly, why would they send a runaway carriage not along a flat section of track where it'll eventually slow down and stop, but careening down a hill at breakneck speed along a public street? Slamming into a turntable at the end of the line somehow causes it to spin around, and I must know, who builds a roundhouse where the only way to get to the turntable on foot is to traverse a slippery, narrow rail above a hole that leads to the centre of the earth? I swear, the ICC must have made a law about that at some point. The tunnel they follow comes out in the middle of this industrial district, but rather than ending at a station or even a set of buffers, the rails just come together at the end of the tunnel, which makes me wonder what the point of that line even is. The kids wander about, meet Santa, and learn the true Christmas spirit, eventually bringing us to our final era, that being this pump cart. While I admit the brass wheels do make it look sick as hell, my issue is why would you use a pump cart to move a carriage? You don't have a shunting engine or something on standby for this kind of work? Also, why are elves using something that's clearly too big for them to operate? You'd think that with how industrial this place is, they'd have something more suited for their size. I'll tell you what, between the workplace harassment, poorly maintained equipment, suicidal track placement, and the sheer disregard for workplace safety, it's honestly amazing that nobody's been seriously hurt by Santa's negligence before. I'm telling you, it's a lawsuit just waiting to happen. Where there's blame, there's a claim, is what my uncle told me. Threw his back out at work, he did. Kept telling his boss he needed proper lifting equipment, tried to move 5 bags of coal on his own, and he was halfway through the second when And there we have it, The Polar Express. Is this my favourite Christmas movie? No. The story is pretty flat, I find it hard to invest in Hero Boy as a character, there's a bunch of just messing about and time wasting towards the end, and yes, the characters and animations still look as uncanny as they did 20 years ago. All that being said, there's still plenty in this movie to admire. Like I said earlier, it's just got a nice vibe to it, and when you look at it from a filmmaking point of view, it only gets more impressive. Robert Zemeckis as a director is always doing interesting things with the camera. Not just composing nice shots, but putting the camera in interesting places, tracking through glass, and doing impressive long takes. Seriously, the entire musical bit where they arrive at the North Pole has no cuts, but it flows smoothly. Zemeckis himself said that to make the film live action would have cost $1 billion, and given the cinematography and attention to detail, I can't say I blame him. Yes, some stuff does suffer from that early 2000s low quality texturing, but it still looks stunning when it counts. I even bought a copy of the original book to compare it with the film, and while the book is much less adventurous, the kid literally just goes to the North Pole and meets Santa with no interference, the film does a fantastic job of translating Chris Van Allsburg's illustrations from book to screen. And that's not even going over the countless hidden tributes to 1225, A Christmas Carol, and so much more, or mentioning how the motion capture technology paved the way for future projects like Jim Carrey's Christmas Carol or James Cameron's Avatar. There's so much more to this movie than just its story, so I can totally see how this has ended up as so many people's favourite Christmas film. And yes, I do know about the sliding elf, the other Back to the Future references, and a bunch of other tidbits that the comments are going to eagerly share. I just don't have time to go over them all in this video, and I don't really want to change the subject too much from the trains. Speaking of, I'd give the train accuracy in this movie a solid 5 out of 10. They didn't get every aspect of 1225 correct, but the fact they went through so much effort to make the Polar Express look as close to the real thing as possible certainly earns them some brownie points. What brings the score down, however, is what they do with 1225 and the bizarre physics-bending stuff that goes on around it. I know a lot of it can be explained away as continuity errors or simply that it's a magic train, but I think I've made my feelings on that defense fairly obvious. Was I a little overly picky in places? Perhaps. But I'm harsh because I care. Or at least, that's what my brother told me when he stole all the chocolate I got for Christmas.